In the history of high-stakes gambling, few hands have been played as ruthlessly as the one in the summer of 936. The gun pressed against the player's temple was not a metaphor. It was an entire imperial army sent to execute him. The single chip left in his hand wasn't gold. It was the strategic armor of a civilization for the next 400 years. Most men would accept their fate. But the man sitting in that chair didn't just push the chip into the center to ensure the deal went through. He threw in his own knees and his human dignity as a tip. We are not telling a cheap moral story about a traitor. That is too easy. This is the story of the most ruthless leveraged buyout in history. It is about a rational man backed into a corner by a broken system, calculating the exact exchange rate that would leave his name stinking for 1,000 years. Welcome to the darkest hour of the East. We must pull back the lens to the 10th century East Asian continent. This wasn't just a change of dynasties. It was a massive, out-of-control meat grinder known as the 5 dynasties. You don't need to remember the names. Only the underlying logic, violence, was the only passport. Every emperor was simply the warlord with the strongest army. There were no divine bloodlines, no sacred rights, just men holding knives. In this high-pressure cooker, the central government and the warlords were trapped in a dead loop of suspicion. The emperor, fearing the warlord, tries to strip his power. The warlord sees the move, assumes he is dead, and rebels immediately. In 936, this loop hit its breaking point. The two main characters were like a cruel joke played by fate. On the throne sat Emperor Li. Commanding the army was General Shai. The irony was that they were technically brothers, both adopted sons of the previous ruler. In a world that worshipped lineage, their legitimacy was zero. They were two beasts locked in the same cage, staring at each other's throats, both certain the other would bite first. In May, the first domino fell. Emperor Li made his move, sending a decree to General Shai's fortress in Taiyuan. Move your post to the east, but in the political code of the time, there was only one way to read it. Leave your army, wash your neck, report to the executioner. General Shi sat in the cold changing room of his fortress. He was 45, a career soldier from the Sharda tribe, silent, even dull. The calculation system in his brain was spinning wildly. Obey the order, physical death resist, political suicide. With the forces of just one region, he could never stand against the war machine of the entire empire. The system had left him no exit, so he made his first move. He didn't prepare defenses. Quiet man tore off his mask. He stabbed directly at the emperor's deepest wound, publicly calling Emperor Li a beggar, an adopted fraud unfit for the throne. This wasn't politics. This was a declaration of war. The system retaliated instantly. The imperial army flooded north, a black tide of steel. By late summer, the city of Taiyuan was an island. Picture the scene. To starve Shai out, the army dug a trench miles long around the city. It was the height of summer, and the heat was suffocating. Inside the walls, the granaries were empty. Soldiers began scraping the rancid grease from their leather armor just to boil a soup. The air was thick with the smell of rotting bodies and despair. Death was creeping toward the city center inch by inch. In this sealed coffin of a city, General Shai held his final war council. His top general, Laidu, slammed his fist on the table. We have walls, we have reserves, we fight to the last man. We do not bow to the foreigners. Yes, Liu mentioned the foreigners, because everyone knew that on the northern steppes a giant eye was watching the Khitan Empire. General Shi said nothing. He looked at Liu with a terrifying calmness. He knew Liu was a hero, but heroes are worthless in front of a calculator. Defending to the death simply meant postponing death by a month. She didn't need to postpone it. He needed to flip the table. From the shadows stepped a strategist. Advisor sang. This man's appearance matched the twisted situation, a face long and pale, like a winter gourd, ugly, but with a brain colder than ice. He whispered the plan everyone feared to speak. My lord, to live, the Khitan Emperor must bring his iron cavalry south. But there was a fatal problem. Why would the Khitans help? The Khitan Emperor was not a charity worker. He was the apex predator of the region. He didn't want gold. He could just take gold. He needed something of strategic value. General Shi looked up. In that second, he completed his alienation as a human being. He stopped being a guardian and became a pure gambler. He drafted a letter with 2 conditions that sucked the air out of the room. Condition 1, the real estate. Not just land, but the 16 prefectures, the Yen mountain range, the Great Wall. He was offering to package the only natural barrier protecting the civilization and hand the keys to the bandit. Condition 2, the madness. Shai was 45. He formally requested to adopt the 34-year-old Khitan Emperor as his father. He would rule as the Sun Emperor. He used father to buy the legal excuse. He used the 16 prefectures to buy the motive. Advisor Sang finished the letter. The ink was wet. Every character was a black hole ready to swallow history outside. The war. Drums pounded. General Shi took the seal. He stamped the paper. The gamble had begun. The letter moved faster than any horse. It pierced the siege lines of Taiyuan and raced north, landing on the desk of the Khitan Emperor. For him, this was not a negotiation. It was a winning lottery ticket. For decades, the Empire of the Steppe had smashed its head against the mountain defenses of the Central Plains, only to be thrown back every time. Now the owner of the mountains was offering to dismantle the gate, hand over the keys, and kneel in the dirt to call him daddy. There was no hesitation. The war machine of the north roared to life. By September, the autumn winds began to howl, and 50,000 heavily armored Khitan cavalry crossed the Great Wall. They hit the battlefield like a black tsunami. The imperial troops besieging the city were veterans. Tough men who had fought in the mud for months. But against heavy cavalry charging on open ground, they were harvested like wheat before a scythe. It wasn't a battle, it was a dimensional crush. The siege shattered in hours. General Shi stood on the ramparts, watching the carnage below. He had won. The system that tried to crush him was burning, but the price of admission was due immediately. That night, the gates of Taiyan swung open. She did not ride out as a conqueror in armor. He dressed in the plain, submissive robes of a subordinate and walked into the Khitan camp. The scene, even viewed through the lens of history centuries later, carries a sickening sense of absurdity. She, 45 years old, his beard speckled with gray, knelt without a flicker of hesitation before the 34-year-old Khitan Emperor, who sat on a tiger-skin chair. She bowed his head and formally declared himself a son and subject. The Khitan Emperor knew exactly how to play the scene. He laughed, took off his own fur coat, and draped it over Shi's shoulders. He held Shi's hand and beamed at his nobles. "Look at us. Do we not look like father and son?" The Khitan nobles laughed. Shi smiled. But behind those smiles, a massive, irreversible transfer of power was finalized. Shi didn't just sell his pride, he liquidated the strategic sovereignty of the Central Plains for the next 4 centuries. Then came the coronation. Under the cold stare of foreign blades, Shi was declared emperor of the later Jin. He wore the crown, but everyone could see the truth. It was not a symbol of rule, but a collar around his neck. Shi had secured the throne. He had survived. But like a desperate man who signs a loan with the devil, the moment the party ended, the collection agents moved in. Shi thought giving up the land was a one-time transaction. He was wrong. He had signed a contract of infinite liability. When you downgrade yourself to a son, you lose the right to say number. Every year, Emperor She had to bleed his own country dry to send massive tributes north to his father. The economic drain was catastrophic, but the political cost was even higher. The title of Sun Emperor was a poison that seeped into the foundation of his legitimacy. His people hated him, branding him a traitor. His own generals, proud, violent men, looked at him with undisguised contempt. Even General Liu, the patriot who had wanted to fight to the death, obeyed orders but spat on the ground in private. "It is one thing to submit," he muttered, "but to call him father, that is filth." This disdain spread like a plague. Shi found that the alliance he forged to save his life became the very thing that made ruling impossible. Any warlord could now rebel against him and claim the moral high ground. Shi spent the rest of his life walking a tightrope over an abyss. He was terrified of offending the North, and equally terrified of his own subjects. He was forced to smile while Khitan envoys insulted him in his own palace, swallowing the humiliation day after day. 7 years later, the pressure finally broke him. In 942, he fell ill, surrounded by curses. On his deathbed, he didn't even dare pass the throne to his own son, knowing the fragile government was made of glass. He died at 51, consumed by anxiety, a broken man. The father-son alliance collapsed less than 4 years after his death. When his successor tried to stop the payments, the Khitan army returned. This time, they didn't come to protect their son. They came to foreclose. They erased the puppet dynasty they had built, making the later Jin one of the shortest-lived regimes in history. But the true tragedy was not the fall of a dynasty. It was the mutilation of a civilization's geography. The loss of the 16 prefectures did more than just move a border. It rewired the DNA of Chinese history, along with the mountain fortresses. The Central Plains lost their primary horse breeding grounds. This was catastrophic. Without these pastures, the dynasty that followed, the Song lost the ability to breed heavy war horses. They were forced to fight a 400-year war against mobile cavalry using only slow-moving infantry. It was a strategic nightmare. This imbalance fundamentally changed the national psyche. The expansive, confident empires of the past were gone, replaced by a wealthy but anxious giant. Forever forced to play defense, the Song became an economic powerhouse. Yes, but a military dwarf compelled to buy peace with silver because they could not win it with steel. For 400 years, the psychological shadow of those lost territories hung over every emperor. The Great Wall was no longer a shield. It was a line behind enemy lines. The door was broken, and the wolves were already inside the house. Let us freeze the frame on that dark night in 936. On that piece of parchment stamped with red ink, The text is complex, but the math is simple. A bankrupt business owner, desperate to seize control of the company, went to a loan shark. He borrowed capital he could never repay. He thought he was just mortgaging a piece of land. But in reality, he leveraged the future safety of millions. Shai was not a monster. He was a rational man backed into a dead end. Faced with a choice between immediate extinction and survival at any cost, he chose survival. He calculated the price perfectly. He just made sure the rest of history picked up the tab. This is the nature of power. At this table, there are no winners. There are only gamblers who haven't lost yet. And the house that always collects.